Of all the dwarves climbing the gigantic stone staircase which led to the Hall of Legends, Growrat Deepmaker was sure that he was the weariest. His old legs ached, his old lungs wheezed, and despite the cool night air, beads of sweat ran down his face and dripped from the tip of his snowy white beard. Growrat wanted to stop. He wanted to sit down on one of the wide stone steps carved into the mountainside and look out over the valley below. But he couldn't. His pride wouldn't allow it. And neither would his granddaughter, who was skipping lightly up the staircase beside him. "Look, grandfather," she squealed, grabbing his gnarly, wrinkled hand with her little soft one. "Is that the entrance?" "Aye, Gretchen," Growrat grumbled. "And why in the name of the ancient ones they had to build the thing halfway up a bloody mountain, I'll never know." "Of course you know," Gretchen said with childish indignation. "You're the one who told me. This place is sacred to our people. It was on this very mountainside that the great king—" "Oh, spare me the history lesson, child," Growrat snapped. "We'll be getting enough history tonight." Gretchen let go of his hand and turned her face back to the vast oak doors ahead of them. Growrat sighed and awkwardly adjusted his burgundy cap. He looked around at the crowd of other dwarves climbing the steps, daring them to comment or even look sideways at him. None of them did so. "I'm sorry, Gretchen," he said in a low voice. "I'm just a grumpy old dwarf who keeps forgetting that this is your first telling. You're excited, just like I was. It's just a bit harder up these stairs the 100th time." Gretchen smiled at him. "That's okay. I know you're too old to be doing this. Your face has got all red and everything." Growrat managed to swallow the angry retort that sprung hotly to his mouth. The girl spoke the truth after all. He was the oldest dwarf making the ascent. By rights it should have been Gretchen's parents escorting her to her first telling. But they were gone. Growrat's brave and handsome son, his fierce and jolly daughter-in-law, both victims of the War of Endless Fog, both killed in battle, like so many of the sons and daughters of the 13 realms. It was with that thought in his mind that Growrat followed the eager Gretchen up the last few steps and began striding towards the open doors of the Hall of Legends. The cavernous hall was filled with hundreds of dwarves, all of them talking and shouting excitedly, all of them clamouring to find places on the long wooden benches which faced the platform at the far end of the hall. There were families, farmers, traders and crafts dwarves. There were dwarves of noble houses and groups of boisterous young warriors comparing weapons and armour. All of them gave way before Growrat as he led his wide-eyed granddaughter through the crowd and towards the raised platform. Whispers of "Kingsguard" reached his ears. He ignored them. The only dwarf he was interested in guarding tonight was 7 years old, and although it felt traitorous to think it, she was more precious to him than any other dwarf in the kingdom, including the High King. "Here, Gretchen." Growrat pointed to a bench at the very front of the hall, which was almost completely empty. "This is for us." Gretchen climbed up and sat with her feet dangling high above the stone floor. Growrat gave a dignified wave of greeting to the few other members of the King's Guard who were seated on the bench. Then he sat down, trying his best to stifle an enormous groan of relief. Growrat half dozed through the preliminary section of the evening. Pompous nobles recited flowery poems, and the audience responded with barrages of good-natured insults and a few mouldy vegetables. A band played, and the hall thrummed with hundreds of deep voices joining in during the choruses. A juggler held golden axes high into the air, and Gretchen clapped and cheered along with the rest of the throng. Then Broughton Gruntlog stepped onto the stage, and, within seconds, the entire hall had fallen completely silent. It wasn't just Broughton's position as supreme lawkeeper of the 13 realms which inspired such awe and reverence from the assembled dwarves. It wasn't the dire-forged blade which hung from his belt, or even the white full-moon war paint which covered his entire face, marking him as a legendary warrior. It was his eyes, his dark, unblinking eyes, which swept over the crowd with ferocious intensity, almost daring someone to speak, daring someone to cough or slurp too loudly on their flask of mead. No dwarf did. No dwarf dared move a muscle. Broughton held that silence until it became almost a physical presence in the hall, a thick, suffocating blanket which was only removed when the mighty lore-keeper at last spread his arms wide and spoke in a warm, deep voice.
My fellow dwarves, you've come here tonight for the telling of our story. Many of you have traveled long and difficult roads to be here. In fact, there are dwarves here tonight from each of the 13 realms, and I welcome you all.
Broughton paused long enough to allow for some brief, respectful cheering to echo around the hall before he raised a calming hand.
For some of you, this is your first telling.
Broughton looked directly at Gretton, and Growlithe saw her round eyes shining with pride.
And some of you have heard me speak the story of our people more times than you may care to remember.
With this, Broughton gave Growlithe the slightest nod, which the old dwarf returned solemnly.
But every year, our legacy grows. Every year there is more to tell. And although this last year has added chapters to our history which may not be pleasant to recall, still they must become part of the telling. For that is how we preserve our history. And our history must be preserved.
Broughton stood at the very front of the stage and closed his eyes. For a long moment he stood, his grey eyebrows tightly furrowed, and his right hand absently caressing the obsidian gemstone embroidered into his moss-green cape. When his eyelids slowly opened, his gaze was distant, as though he was staring out through the side of the mountain at something far away.
Fill your pipes and gather your loved ones close,
he said.
Make sure you're comfortable and have plenty to eat and drink. For our story is a long one, and it begins like this.